Good day and welcome to our series on non-traditional education. My name is Luis Sanchez and I'm happy to be here and sharing these wonderful ideas with you, okay? One of the things that I think is really important, and I had the wonderful opportunity when I was in the States to discuss with my new in-laws, who are all educators, the concept of this non-traditional education. They were intrigued, stimulated, and we carried out some wonderful conversations. So I want to make this series something similar to that, a more conversational type of presentation, okay? First of all, to start, it's always best to start in the very beginning. And the beginning for me was the third year working here in Radians school, where I had what I found, or what I thought, was the group from hell. Now, previous to that, I thought I was a pretty good teacher. We did a lot of activities. Radians has always been known for doing a lot of activities. So my class did a lot of activities. But this particular group, for some unbeknownst reason, decided they weren't going to work. And I decided they were going to work because that was my traditional mentality back then. I wasn't going to be defeated. But actually, every day was a defeat for me because the students really weren't doing anything. And they really weren't learning. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but not the least of which was the traditional style of teaching. That, I think more than anything else, disengaged the students. Every day I woke, and my desire was not to come to work. My desire was, I didn't want to teach anymore. My wife even said, if you hate the job so much, stop doing it, okay? Luckily, I didn't. I'm hard-headed, I stayed, and I had the wonderful opportunity that year to go to a conference. And this particular conference dealt with cooperative learning. And as I began to understand the concepts of cooperative learning as a first step to in non-traditional education, there was suddenly a resurgence of interest in teaching again. And I wanted to teach dynamic classes. I wanted the students to enjoy the classes that they were taking without minimizing the actual learning content. And we're going to be talking a little bit about all of these kind of things. But we have to understand that traditional education in and of itself doesn't work, at least not for today's student. If we can't accept those myths as a truth, that traditional education doesn't work, then it's really hard for us to go into non-traditional education. Now, you can't just reform education. You can't say, well, I'm going to teach half traditional and half non-traditional, because it doesn't work. When something is incorrect, if you build a building and the foundation is not correct, the building will collapse. Well, traditional education is that way. The foundation of traditional education is rotten. Therefore, reforming it is not an option. We have to revolutionize and completely change it. And that's what we're hoping can be done with the non-traditional education. Now, I say hoping just to throw in a little bit of casting of doubt, but the reality is I know that that is how it's going to be changed. And is what we're going to learn during this time period the end-all and do-all? Absolutely not. There's so much more to do and so much more expansion to go to. But we'll get there when we get there, okay? So, to begin with, I have to say that traditional education is built upon certain myths, certain ideas that we accept to be true. And to get rid of these ideas, excuse me one second, the thing doesn't want to change. There we go. When we get rid of these ideas, there's an empty space in the brain that needs to get filled with something else. Otherwise, those ideas will come back. So we're going to be working with that, okay? If we visualize education as an industry, I think it's most akin to agriculture and the differences within agriculture, especially when we talk about industrialized agriculture and organic agriculture. And when we talk about industrialized agriculture, we're talking about agriculture that focuses on the plant itself, increasing the yield, increasing the production, bigger tomatoes, bigger plants. Mankind has been great in doing that, and they've achieved tremendous things with it. We see miles and miles of corn if we go to the Midwest United States, because they're using mechanized agriculture. which is the first step. Mechanized agriculture is the very first step of industrialized agriculture. It allows you to plant these miles and miles of corn, but it's all the same. And one of the problems with that is that it depletes the soil of certain nutrients, so that if you're going to plant again in the future, following corn will be different. How do you solve that problem? Well, they use fertilizers. And so they developed a series of chemical fertilizers to replace all the nutrients that have been lost from the growing of the corn. And finally, you have pesticides, because you're producing bigger crops. You don't want these crops to get destroyed, but when you use chemical fertilizers, a lot of the protective properties of the plant are lost. Therefore, you have to use pesticides. And pesticides not only have a primary effect of killing insects, but it has a secondary effect of killing all types of insects, even the beneficial ones, and of polluting our rivers and contaminating our land. So this kind of agriculture, while successful and continues to be used, is actually a non-sustainable model of agriculture. Just like traditional education is a non-sustainable model of education, where we're focused on the student and producing output and increasing output and increasing the production. And so when we think of it that way, we realize, wait a second, that's not sustainable. However, there is another option, which we call organic agriculture, if we're talking about agriculture, where the focus is not the plant itself and the yield of the plant, but rather the preparation of the soil. And when we grow things in a soil that is properly prepared, properly nutritioned, then we have plants that are bigger, stronger, and varied, resistant to insects, and it's a very sustainable form of agriculture. Well, in the very same way, we want to do an organic education where the focus isn't just on increasing the output of the students, but rather creating the environment where students can learn. And if the focus is instead on that, then by natural recourse, the plants will come up correctly, or our students will grow up correctly, because we created the environment for them to thrive. This is the difference between non-traditional education and traditional education. So in a way, when we say student-centered education, it's slightly incorrect, because we're environment-centered education that allows the students to grow to their full potential and creativity. And if we understand this difference, we can understand the difference between traditional education and non-traditional education. So how do we achieve that? Because it sounds like a great idea, but great ideas are a dime a dozen. We need a practical way of being able to do that. And so to begin, as I mentioned before, we're going to learn about the myths of education. Myth number one. The most important thing is the content. Now, while yes, the content is important, it is not the single most important thing, because our students are much more than just a brain or just fact machines. And sometimes, and I'll be referring to this, some of this will give me ideas and remind me of what I'm going to be talking about. But for example, content, when you try to deliver content, and this is what traditional education works, they want to deliver content, and you have a receiver, which is the student. And in many ways, that creates an adversarial relationship where you're going to teach the student's going to learn. But what happens if the student chooses not to learn? What happens if the student decides, hey, I don't want to learn this? Then it becomes a conflictive thing, which is what occurred to me my third year here. I determined my students were going to learn this. They determined they weren't going to do it. So you see, focusing on the content in and of itself is not sufficient. On the second level, there is no way that we can teach all the content that a student will need forever. But more important is teaching him how to access that content so that he can become a self-directed learner. That's two different things, and we're going to talk about that in the future. Okay? So the beginning of the end of any teaching environment is that conflict between student and teacher on content. Next, the teacher has to be the expert. Now, being the expert means that you determine what content a student needs to learn. Now, I was raised up in the 60s and 70s, so my concept of what a student needs to learn will be vastly different from the reality of a student from 2010 or 2020. Therefore, what I think is content, should be the content, because I'm the expert, is not necessarily the content. And one of the things that teachers have to do, at least traditional teachers, is make believe that we know everything. That every question a student asks, we have to know the answer to. A teacher of today doesn't have to do that. And we'll talk more about that later on. But it's important to understand that this is a myth, that teachers don't need to know everything, and that in essence, the teacher is in a position of a learner as well as the learner is. Myth number 3, the teacher has to complete the entire textbook. Now this one is one that, for me, it's easy to debunk, and I think that most teachers will agree with that, and yet, how often do we not fall prey to having to finish the entire textbook? Okay? The textbook is a tool, and this is how we must sell it to the academic community. The textbook is not the curriculum, it is a tool to teach whatever we decide in the curriculum that is important. That's why it's important that we're in tune with the needs of today and that the curriculum is a relevant curriculum. Okay? Both student and teacher must be perfect. This one has done so much harm to our students and to education in general. They must be perfect. That means they must seek the correct answer. And so, if a student is going up through a traditional educational system, he is learning to conform to finding the correct answers. Everything else is irrelevant because his grade is determined by how many correct answers he gets. So the process of learning itself is not taken into account. How many correct answers? What did you do on a test? How did you do on the preset? How did you do on the college boards? How do you do on the SAT? Becomes the almighty ruling, controlling thing. This damages education because it kills our students' creativity and their curiosity, and conformity becomes the name of the game. There's a wonderful song by Pink Floyd called "The Wall," and it says, "Hey teacher, leave those kids alone. Okay, we don't need no education." Well, this is really true, because if we're going to have an education of conformity, education in and of itself is a failure. Next, fairness is a one-size-fits-all curriculum. I'm forgetting to move the slides. There we go. Fairness is a one-size-fits-all curriculum. Step back and think a little bit about that. Is every student the same? Obviously not. Does every student learn the same way? Obviously not. And yet we continue to teach in the same way, giving the same education to every single student, and we expect them to learn the same way. And then when that student who's not a learner in the particular style that we're teaching, then we say he's not intelligent. Oh, no. You know, he's a C student, but he's really trying. The reality is that he's beginning to learn how to conform to the system. And he may be, say, a visual learner, but because the class isn't given in a visual format, he has to figure out a way to be able to survive these waters of craziness in order to pass the class. And so this puts so much pressure on the student that he begins to do things that he wouldn't ordinarily do. Okay? So for example, if I want to succeed and I know the grades are important, then I'm going to cheat to get those good grades because I have to, get the good grades no matter what happens. Education itself is not meant to work in that fashion. I'll even go further than that, to say that education should have absolutely no grades whatsoever, and that's an idea espoused by many, many New Age educators, but we'll talk about that in the future. Okay? The next one says, we need a summative assessment for accountability of teachers. I love this one. Okay? I think it's an interesting concept. The fact that everything that you've learned can be summed up on one exam, and if you pass that exam, and if your entire class passes that exam, then the teacher's a good teacher. And if the entire class fails that exam, then the teacher's not a good teacher. And that becomes a basis for determining what is a good teacher and what is a bad teacher, as opposed to where is the passion of the educator. How much does he allow the students to create and to develop new concepts and new ideas outside of the scope of traditional education? See, we don't take that into account. We accept that the most important thing is that number grade at the end of the year. Now, this is true for everyone. The teachers fall prey to that, but the parents also fall prey to that. I can't tell you how many times I've had teachers sit in front of my desk, and not teachers, parents sit in front of my desk and tell me, But my child's got to see, my child's got to see, as though the C determined the value of that child. The difference is that that C child has the exact same value as an A child. Let's find out how they're being taught. Let's find out if that curiosity is being sparked, if that natural, innate desire of a student to learn is really being fomented in the class. Okay? So when we work with the non-traditional system here, we have over 100 different assessment materials, assessment tools. And these are kind of things that we're going to be talking about also in future lessons, okay? Myth number 7. Now this one says, learning is typically focused on the brain. Yet we know that human beings are not just the brain. You know, they're composed of also willpower, they're composed of emotions, they're composed of spirit and soul, if you want to believe in those things. But the fact of the matter is that it's not just only intellectual. And so education, in order to be holistic, has to encompass those elements as well. Now, one of the bad things about it is that we're only focused on the intellectual part, and I question whether it's intellectual. I want to say memorization part, because if they memorize well, they're going to do well on the exam. Even institutions that are fomenting non-traditional education or alternative education still fall into this trap, the trap of memorization. That memorization denotes intelligence. And this is an argument that Sadhguru and Sir Ken Robinson have pointed out, that intelligence involves so many more elements than just your capacity to recite, memorize facts or data or information. Now, I think the students know, I know the students know, that it's not necessary to memorize everything. You have all the information at your fingertips. You can find anything you want to find out. As a matter of fact, I challenge you, if you don't have a student take an exam who's gone through a class of history, and then have another student who has not gone through that class of history, but give him access to the internet and let him take that test. I will bet you money down which student will do better. Okay? Because the students of today are not required to memorize information, but rather to learn processes. And these are something that we're going to be talking about a little bit later as I fly through these components of traditional education. Learners need to use their time consuming content by other people. Now, this is a focus on traditional education. But today, we want our students creating information, creating data, creating content that they can use and also pass on to other groups. And this develops a growth in the I don't want to say intellectual capacity, because we have to define what intellectual capacity is, but that's really what it is. You know, I mean, we're helping students develop intellectually in every aspect, not just the memorization aspect. Okay. Next, and by the way, this also brings to mind that there's an education called education of the heart, and that includes values and virtues and empathy and sympathy and all of these things that connect humans as social beings to one another. The importance of the human relationship and the human experience as opposed to just a direct memorization of data or facts. So non-traditional education should involve emotions and heart. Okay? Next. Teachers should do most of the work in talking in a classroom. Yes, they should not be doing that really, because where is the student? As opposed to being a passive receiver, the student should be actively involved in his classroom. And yet even in non-traditional schools, I see teachers who talk so much. 99% of the class is the teacher talking, and 1% of the class is the students doing something, an activity, okay? Or an involvement in something else. In non-traditional education, teachers should be talking less than 10% of the class, if at all. I'm a strong proponent of what they call the Harkness table, where the facilitator doesn't speak at all unless it's absolutely essential. And that allows the students, now that implies something, that implies trusting the students to want to learn. And here is why what the problem is, because we don't really believe that students want to learn. We think, as educators, traditional educators, that we have to force students to learn because students don't really want to learn. And yet, in non-traditional education, we part from the premise that every student wants to learn and that it's abnormal for a student not to want to learn. So if teachers are talking all the time, then can you blame a student for not being interested in the classes? And the thing is, the teachers are not talking with the students, they're talking at the students. And students shut down when somebody's talking at them. The next one. The technology is an add-on, specialty, or afterthought. That's not a problem in this institution because I think everyone has pretty much embraced that technology is here to stay. And if they hadn't embraced it before, obviously COVID made it absolutely essential that we rely on technology. Now, is technology the do-all, end-all? Not at all. Another tool, just like a textbook. The technology becomes only a tool to be used by the educator to achieve whatever objective he has with a particular group. And when we understand that, then we use it appropriately. When we use it as a babysitting tool, as it is used quite often, where a parent feels the child needs to be entertained, so here's iPad, and play around with that, and then you remove yourself from the responsibility of having to educate this child. Now, there's a writer called Alfie Kohn who was saying that rewarding students is a mistake. That when you reward a student, his interest actually diminishes. That when you give a student, for example, a star, or you give him bonus points, or you allow him not to do a homework if he does a certain work well, then the student begins to work for the payment rather than working for the learning experience itself. Okay? That, however, means that, for example, if a parent is paying his child to get an A in the school, then maybe the parent has to stop paying the child. Maybe that means the parent has to work a little bit harder with the child. Well, the same thing with the non-traditional educator. If the non-traditional educator is working with a child and he can't reward the child, then he has to kind of work a little bit harder with the child. Misbehavior needs to be disciplined by the teacher. Another absurdity. Because misbehavior is a result of having a student being bored. If a student is engaged in the classroom, you don't have misbehavior. So misbehavior to be disciplined by the teacher, an absurd concept. It should not be occurring in a non-traditional environment, and yet it occurs. Okay? So one of the things, I had a wonderful experience talking with one of our facilitators yesterday, and we were talking just about this particular point. And he was saying, well, why, if the classes are so engaging, are we having students misbehaving? And then I come back with the question, are our classes truly engaging? This is something to think about. Okay? The one that the grades must fall within the bell curve. Okay, the bell curve is an absurd assumption created by who knows who, and everyone just accepted it as a reality because there has to be a top group of students and there has to be a lower group of students. And everything in between, that's where the average people fall. Okay, that's the traditional concept, traditional education way of thinking. That means that before any student steps into my class, I know that I will have some students who are going to fail. Can you sense the absurdity in that when you think every child is intelligent? When you start, every child wants to learn. And now you're saying that 20% of them, because that's what the bell curve says, 20% of the students will be low achievers or underachievers. And this is wrong. However, non-traditional education should give you a graph that's more this way, where you have a few below average, a couple average, and many, many, many above average. When you achieve that kind of a graph, then you know that you're beginning to work non-traditional education. I didn't say we completed it, I said we're beginning to. Myth number 13, I love this one. Students should get more homework because with homework, they learn more and it proves how rigorous a school we are. You know, this is an absurdity. Okay? As a matter of fact, there's so many questions as to whether homework has value at all. People say, well, you know, it's because they learn to be responsible. Well, I can tell you, I got a lot of homework when I was a kid. Did not teach me to be responsible. Taught me to do the homework because if I didn't do the homework, I would get an F. That it taught me. So based on the fear of getting the F, not because I was a responsible person, but because I feared the F, I did the homework. Okay? On the other side of the coin, is giving any homework meaningless? Not necessarily. There are certain types of homework that can be given that are very valuable. Okay, so Alfie Kohn, the person I cited the other time, also said that. He said if we give students less homework, in Finland, by the way, in the video made by Roger Moore, the very first sentence he says, I discovered the secret of Finland's success. By the way, Finland is #1 in education in the world. He said, I found the secret of Finland. And he says, right off the bat, the very beginning, the first 5 minutes of the film, he says, their secret, they don't give homework. Okay? That's exactly how his video begins. Now we have countries like South Korea, Japan. These are homework-intensive schools, but they also have the highest rate of student suicides. They also have the highest rate of student burnout and stress out. Okay? In India, the competition between students is so strong that when they take their tests to go into university level, the parents are sneaking answers through the windows. That's how intense that competition becomes. Okay? So it's important to understand, more homework does not necessarily mean better school. Classrooms should be quiet. It should be quiet because students need to concentrate when they're learning. Absurd. Students need to be engaged actively in what we're doing. They need to be talking, they need to be sharing, sometimes singing, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing, but engaged in a social manner for there to be true learning. Okay? There might be true memorization in a silence reading. There might be even some students learning who are linguistic learning. But in the general scheme of things, if a classroom is silent, concern yourselves as to whether there's any genuine learning going on. 15th, the students today read less than students of my time period. Look, the reality is, and the studies are showing, that students are actually reading more. That they're buying more books, books that we used to borrow before. Yeah, they don't go to the library quite as much. Why? Because they're buying these books off Amazon. They buy and they read much more than we used to read when we were younger. Of course, the concept is a very good concept because you don't see them walking around with books, but you see them walking around with the tablets. You see them walking around with their e-books, with their cell phones, and they're constantly reading. Ah, yes, but they're reading Facebook, or they're reading Instagram, or they're writing in TikTok. The reality is that, yes, that occurs. But also reality, they're also reading more academic books than we used to read during our time period in school. Okay? So the traditional results. After you've graduated and you go to your first job interview and they ask you the question, I see you did well in school, but what real-world skills do you have? I can take tests. I know how to take tests. Okay? So we have to analyze ourselves and see that we're not doing any of these things that are considered traditional, things that traditional education does. So I postulate these questions for you. Which do you believe is the hardest of the traditional school myths to let go? Is it possible to transcend these myths and replace them with other concepts and ideas? Is it difficult? Is it easy? And why? Okay? I leave these in your hands because this is the first introduction of videos of the series. I hope you enjoyed. If you have a question or a doubt, please feel free to email. Thank you.